Hi, I'm Mark Dance, and I'm going to show you some videos of my model railway I've been working on for about 4.5 years. These videos are shot in January of 2010, and I started construction on the layout in June of 2005. I designed it for about 3 years before then. The layout's housed in a two-car garage. The garage is insulated and it has a 100 cubic foot per minute fan to help extract some of the heat from people when they're operating. The layout is designed for operation. It's one of my primary focuses and interests. It's been operating now for about 18 months, and we've had about 6 full operating sessions and a number of smaller ones in that time frame. The layout is fully operational, but only partially scenic, and most of the buildings are just simply mock-ups at this point. The layout represents several subsections, subdivisions of the Canadian Pacific in the southern mainline of British Columbia, as they existed around 1970. At that time, some of the lines had been abandoned. Originally, it was part of a main line that continued all the way to Vancouver through the very famed Kettle Valley subdivisions, but with those abandonments, the line basically turned into a long branch. Some subdivisions include the Nelson subdivision coming into Nelson. The primary modeled area is the boundary subdivision over at the summit at Farron and then down into Cascade, but it also includes the Slocan subdivision up to Slocan City. The rail barge connection to the Kaslo, the remnants of the Kaslo subdivision, which were added from Rosebery to Nakusp at that time. So I'll give you a quick walking tour on this video of what we can see, and then we'll have a few other videos that will be posted to YouTube. This is the easternmost model section, which is Troupe Junction, which is about 5 miles to the east of Nelson. And it was here that the Burlington Northern, originally the Great Northern, came into the area. There's a turning Y for the Great Northern trains that continue to operate until, I believe, into the 90s. But the primary Canadian Pacific section, which goes off into storage and staging, is the Nelson subdivision. So it comes into this area, which is actually a register station, and it continues along the main line, across a couple of rivers, past the large Kootenay Forest Products mill, operational in the 1970, into the division point of Nelson. Try to model Nelson as close to the prototype as I can within the space that I have. The diesel house is a very significant feature of the yard at that time. It was built for the servicing of the Fairbanks Morse locomotives that existed and were a feature of that area. Many C-liners and H-liners and the occasional trainmaster that served trail. The Nelson Station roundhouse was being used as a car maintenance facility at that time, and then I expanded the RIP track section into a stub classification yard. So big differences between this yard and the prototype is much fewer tracks in the southern Nelson area and the use of a stub classification as opposed to a through classification that existed. All of this yard was along the bank of the Kootenay Lake. So continuing further to the west, along what's now the boundary subdivision, it followed the river, Kootenay River at that point, crossed a significant set of bridges near Tagum, and then through the junction area of South Slocan. We'll come back to that in a moment. The model then has significant compression and crosses the Slocan River and then heads into the junction town of Kaslo. It was here that the Rossland subdivision headed south, and as I've modeled into staging, which is to trail, a significant smelter, a trail Kaminko smelter, as well as the fertilizer plant at Warfield. So here we have a small yard for use by the craft switcher, some trailer on flat car and freight house operations, and then there's 2 large industries that were just to the west of Kaslo. I've compressed them, brought them closer to Kaslo. One is the large pulp mill, Celgar pulp mill that was in the area. This area here is solely the pulp mill, and then I brought from the west of the pulp mill, I brought to the east of the pulp mill the Sawmill Operation. So this is a single operation during an operating session. The craft switcher runs from Nelson, comes here, large trains of 20 plus cars going in and going out, and staying out of the way of the through trains going through the area. The main line continues into a hidden 2-turn helix past the pulp mill and emerges on the top of a few hundred feet above the surface of the lower Arrow Lake at a station called Shields. The significant cliff cliffs in the area and the retaining walls were a feature of the line, as well as several large bridges. Continues across a fill trestle, past the maintenance away area, to McCormick Creek Bridge, which I've brought from the east of Shields to the west. Continues through some tunnels in the only scenic area of the railway, and then across, again, some significant bridges. This is the Fire Creek Bridge, a major cut, and then the Bear Creek Bridge. Passing through Tunnel 3, we move on to Corkendall, which was a section house area and was a very long passing siding where the east and west freights often met. And then the line broke away from the lower Arrow Lake. It had been following it along the cliffs until this point and started heading south along Pup Creek, continuing to climb, heading into Bulldog Tunnel, which is where it kind of broke the peaks of the Monashee Mountains, while continuing to climb. It's climbing at about 2.4% right now. Very significant grades in both directions. Through Bulldog Creek, which was quite long. It's about 1 kilometer, or nearly 3/4 of a mile long. Coming out across Porcupine Creek into the summit at Farron Station, which in steam days was a helper station where helpers were kept and serviced, turned, and then dispatched to both sides of the grade, which is quite an unusual operation. At this point, we've crossed the summit. We're starting to fall at 2.4% down McCrae Creek. Features of this area were large snow sheds, some small tunnels, very significant cliffs, a very unstable area, a lot of slides. Through snow sheds, and then across a slide path, across a truss bridge, into the area of Fife. At Fife there was a limestone quarry that supplied flux for the Kaminko smelter at Trail, as well as at one point there were gravel pits as well further to the east. There was also a lumber reload. There was a sawmill on Christina Lake. This whole area is above Christina Lake, and the sawmill there transloaded cut lumber at a facility just above Christina Lake. Coming along some cuts in the bench lands above Christina Lake, eventually crossing a very significant bridge, the fourth crossing of the Kettle River. This bridge will be modeled in full size. The other bridges to this point have been modeled at about 3/4 size. So this model will be full length, full height. Passing then into Cascade, which is the westernmost model area of the boundary subdivision. Here I've taken some modeler's license and I've brought the Carson Spur, which was a connection with the Burlington Northern Republic branch, into this area. So there's a Burlington Northern interchange, as well as an ore reload and a potato warehouse. The train then passes off of the model section to a hidden staging, which is where Midway, Grand Forks, and points further west to the still operating but very rarely used Carmi subdivision in 1970. So that's the final section of the boundary. The second layout that's modeled, second prototype that's modeled, is the Slocan subdivision, which went off the boundary at South Slocan. So here we had a Y and a small facility where the wood chip cars were exchanged between the Slocan sub, which was a major sawmill and pole mill line, and the train running to the pulp mill at Kaslo. So here the line moves into the Slocan subdivision and into the Slocan Valley. Continues to fall along the Slocan River through the area of Valakin, across some trestles, Lemmy Creek Bridge, into Slocan City, where there was a very major sawmill facility, which changed hands a number of times. One of the most significant features of this area was the transloading barge. So trains were actually brought onto the barge, and in this operation, that barge is actually manually moved. There's a pull-out step that takes us to the fourth level. So that barge is moved by hand with the train on board to Rosebery, where the train is then taken off the barge. The train is made up in the Rosebery yard, goes up Summit Creek at about 3% to the passing siding at Summit, and then falls into the terminal town of Nakusp. And both the pre- and post-flooded areas of Nakusp are modeled in this prototype. That's the final section, operating section of the layout.